Let's get started, everybody. So, hi, everybody. I'm Raleigh Latham. I'm the co-host with Neil Spackman of the Sustainable Design Masterclass. We're joined here today by an incredible special guest. He's a filmmaker who's covered ecological restoration across the world, from the Loose Plateau in China to rural Kenya, covering the restoration of tens of thousands of miles. I saw John's presentation at Permaculture Voices too, and it was one of the most inspiring visions for the future that I've ever seen in my life. It doesn't matter what your political views are, doesn't matter what you think the science is on of how we're going to restore ecosystems across the world and degraded lands. John is covering these amazing projects across the world, and he's going to join us to share his vision for global ecosystem regeneration. So we're going to get started with the presentation. So away we go. Thank you for joining us, John.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, for doing this, and Wayne for hosting us with his platform. And I would, just like to say something, because PV2 is where I met who has just passed away.
Toby?
Toby, yeah. And his lecture there, Toby
Hemingway, yeah.
Hemingway. His presentation there was really wonderful too, and I was struck by this, that some people are seeing the philosophical aspects of this, and that was the deepest dive, I think, that I've had in a public place like that. So we should remember his contribution, Gaia Garden, and his urban design book. Really grateful for that, and very sad that he's passed away.
Yeah. He's a good guy. Amazing things to share. Okay. So first off, can everyone see the PowerPoint in the background? We've got, we should have John showing up there with some of his credentials. Everybody can see it? Great. Silas says he can. Daniel says he can.
Throw in some ones, everybody, if you're seeing everything okay.
Yeah. Okay, great. Looks like that's all set. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
Where do you see that?
You got to go to the questions. People can type in and what they can see their comments over the questions.
Okay. Okay, I see it. Yeah.
Great. All right. So yeah, John, let me know when you want to move to the next slide. Whenever.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. No, hold on for a second. Notice that there is a link at the bottom of this, which is the academia page. All of my papers and films are collected there. So if you're not completely fed up with John Luth stuff, you can go there and read what I've been thinking. Basically, everything that I've done has happened in public because I was a journalist working for CBS News, and then for Radio Televisione Italiana, and then Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. I went to China in 1979. I'm actually sitting in Beijing now. There's 25 million people, and I'm looking at the biggest building in Beijing, and the weird wonky CCTV tower is close by. Actually, I don't live here in this mess. I live in the slightly outside, but this has a better internet signal, so I thought I'd come over here today. But let's go to the next slide, and let's see how that works. Can we go to the next slide? And there it is. So I'm really, grateful that you're all here. I'm grateful to everybody for making this possible, and I'm grateful that you're interested to listen to this and to understand what I've been working on for the last 20-some years. So I think since everyone will be able to replay this, I guess we could go ahead and start. I think Raleigh, you're going to have a little change moment at some point, but what I'm going to show is just a very short clip from a film called Hope in a Changing Climate, which came out at the time of the Copenhagen COP15 in 2009. This was the time when the climate change community said that there was going to be some kind of big agreement, but I knew that there couldn't be an agreement because there wasn't very much understanding in that community. And I had the opportunity to make a strong statement. So let's look at that, and then we'll continue this because we're going to go too long if we're not careful.
This is China's List Plateau. Until recently, this was one of the poorest regions in the country. A land renowned for floods, mudslides, and famine. But with the fanfare comes the hope of change for the better. My name is John D. Liu. I've been documenting the changes on the plateau for 15 years. I first came here in 1995 to film an ambitious project where local people were constructing a new landscape on a vast scale, transforming a barren land into a green and fertile one. The project certainly changed my life, convincing me to become a soil scientist. The lessons I've learned in the last few years have made me realize that many of the human tragedies that we regularly witness around the world, the floods, mudslides, droughts, and famines, are not inevitable. Here on the Loose Plateau, I've witnessed that people can lift themselves out of poverty. They can radically improve their environment, and by doing so, reduce the threat of climate change. One thing that became apparent early on is the connection between damaged environments and human poverty. In many parts of the world, there's been a vicious cycle. Continuous use of the land has led to subsistence agriculture, and generation by generation, this has further degraded the soils. The vital question we have to ask is, can this destructive process be reversed? When I first filmed Mr. Ta Fuyuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land. As a result of its success, the lessons learned from the Loose Plateau rehabilitation are now being applied all over China. But could such projects work elsewhere in less centrally controlled societies, with fewer resources and different soils? Ethiopia, perhaps more than any other country, has come to symbolize the vulnerability of humankind to environmental catastrophe. This is a country whose problems have been increased by war and civil conflict. And now, human-induced climate change is predicted to make matters worse. As on the Loose Plateau, centuries of subsistence farming practices have stripped the land of natural vegetation. The dry gullies bear the scars of flash floods. These gullies are evidence of the enormous power of runoff during the rainy season. Without vegetation cover on the hillsides, when the rains come, the water doesn't soak into the ground but flows away in a flood. Then it's not available for agriculture during the rest of the year. This leads to drought, and famously for Ethiopia, famine. But just as I've witnessed in China, there is hope that the situation here can be reversed.
Yeah, that root could survive? No.
In just 6 years, Professor Legessa Nagash and local villagers have transformed a severely eroded terrain by planting indigenous trees and plants. Almost miraculously, a clear flowing stream has emerged where once there was a muddy trickle.
How is it that it's possible for you to get the stream to flow throughout the year?
It is because of the vegetation cover, which has been regenerating on this mountain. This water is maintained in the landscape because as soon as rain falls on the canopy on this vegetation, that rain then infiltrated gradually into the ground, ending up with this steady flow of this river.
If we were to restore the vast areas of the planet where we humans have degraded the soils, just think what an impact we would have in taking carbon out of the atmosphere. As much as 1/4 of the world's land mass has been degraded, and much could be rehabilitated in the way we have seen on the Loose Plateau. And we've only just begun to recognize the real value of natural capital. Surely investing in the recovery of damaged environments is a cost-effective way of solving many of the problems we face today.
What we've seen in China, in Africa, and around the world is that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems. If we can transfer the capital, the technology, and empower the local people to restore their own environment, it'll have enormous benefits. Restoration can sequester carbon, reduce biodiversity loss, mitigate against flooding, drought, and famine. It can ensure food security for people who are now chronically hungry. Why don't we do this on a global scale?
So, thank you. Are you going to bring up the next slide? Yeah, okay. So, basically, everyone, thanks for coming again. But what I learned when I went to the List Plateau was that historically, this area, which was the second place on Earth where settled agriculture began, had been completely destroyed by, as the civilization grew, they completely destroyed their ecosystem function. And what I found in the years after that was that this happens all over the world. So what I was studying was dysfunction in the beginning. And I just didn't know anything about it. I'd been covering the political and economic developments as China was becoming more and more powerful, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of international terrorism and this kind of stuff. And when I saw this, I compared what I was seeing on the Earth systems to these political and economic developments, and I realized that actually the egos and the arrogance, the hubris that you are seeing in global political and economics, and it's reached circus levels now. You know, we're in the theater of the absurd. So when I looked at the landscape in the List Plateau, suddenly something happened and my mind went quiet. And I realized all that confusion out there was not necessary because there were fundamental truths. And essentially what I saw was that when I understood what was going on, so I needed to study a lot about different aspects, geology, chemistry, microbiology, botany, atmospheric science, hydrology. But gradually, as I started to unlock these different things, I realized it's, while it's extremely complex, this complexity is not complicated. The complexity is the relationships, the symbiotic and synergistic relationships between multidimensional systems. It's not something that's not understandable. So what I realized was that what we're seeing in this degraded states is a reduction in biodiversity, and that leads to a reduction in biomass, and that also leads to a reduction in the accumulation of organic matter. And this changes photosynthesis, so there's less carbon sequestration and less oxygen release. And then it changes the microbial habitat, so there's less release of nutrients from geologic materials and less recycling of nutrients because there's less organic material. And then it massively changes the infiltration and retention of available moisture, and that it artificially increases the evaporation rates and the temperatures. This is dramatic. And it increases flooding, drought, and cyclonic winds. Let's show the next clip. I'm hoping that the video will work. Raleigh, are you with us? Let's make that happen.
Oh yes, I'm here. All right, next video.
Exactly what causes a place that was once bountiful to become so degraded?
What has happened here is that originally you had a complete vegetation cover with a fully intact hydrocycle. All the rainfall that fell down stayed where it was initially. It slowly infiltrated into the ground, was absorbed by the root system, went into the groundwater, and eventually drained into the Yellow River over a long period of time, hundreds of days, between a rainfall event and by the time the water ended up in the Yellow River. As the vegetation cover was removed gradually, the runoff increased dramatically every century, every decade, to the point where now when it rains, 95% of the water immediately is lost to the environment where it's coming down. Immediately it runs off in a gully, takes a lot of the topsoil with it, and ends up in the Yellow River. So you have a situation where literally 95% of the water is gone. And this is the reason why this area is so dry, why the rainfall has been decreased, why the vegetation cover can hardly be sustained right now, because everything is so dried up.
These are the conditions in which huge dust storms form, affecting vast areas, as these satellite images show. The consequences of this are felt by everyone. The storms cause disruptions for cities like Beijing and contribute to climate change by allowing sunlight to penetrate but trapping the heat. There is also massive impact to the river system downstream. On average, 1.6 billion tons of sediment clog the river from degraded lands. The phenomenon is sufficiently strange that it even attracts tourists. But for the millions of people living in the Yellow River Basin, the sedimentation is more a source of fear than curiosity. What started as a tiny trickle when settled agriculture began, over time increased until it became a raging torrent. Over 1,500 times in recorded Chinese history, the Yellow River has breached its banks, flooding the plain and leaving destruction and suffering in its wake. When the river flooded in the rainy season, without normal infiltration, it often meant that there was drought in the rest of the year. And with drought came famine. This cycle of flooding, drought, and famine on the List Plateau became well known as China's sorrow.
Great, I'm back. So I think that this study of dysfunction was what got me interested, but after learning about dysfunction, it got kind of depressing, because really the question, well, you could sort of figure it out. It's a little bit, I think, Raleigh used the term ecological forensics. I think that in a sense that's what was going on. We were looking at why was all this taking place, and we could find out. We understood a little bit about what was going on with that. But you know, it was dysfunction. And what's interesting is that you have to ask this question, is it inevitable? And the fact is, it's not inevitable. It's, you have to understand it. If you don't understand it, then you're really likely to continue to do what you've been doing to degrade. The other issue is intention. We'll get to that a little bit later. So, you know, let's look at the next video, because this is showing really what they did to change the situation. So go ahead, Raleigh. I'll pop out.
In order to address these problems, a team of Chinese and foreign experts was assembled in the mid-1990s to design and implement the Loose Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project.
Now, when we came to this place in the Loise Plateau the first time, we were all really shocked. You know, we thought, oh my God, you know, well, how can ever anybody try to rehabilitate an area that is so huge and so fundamentally destroyed ecologically? And the truth is, we spent 2 years working with the local people, with the farmers, with the local officials, with the experts in the various fields of hydrology, soil and water conservation, forestry, agriculture, environment, try to understand what it would take to do something like this. And after 2 years, we still didn't have many answers. The World Bank didn't have the answer, and the local people didn't have the answer. And we spent another 1.5 years talking to the farmers in the villages, trying to understand what they had done in the past 20 or 30 years that was successful. And it was really interesting. Not much was there to show, because the current practices at that time were just not sustainable at all.
Perhaps the most destructive practice was the unrestricted herding of goats and sheep.
For decades and centuries, this area has been heavily grazed by sheep and goats. There was no management structure. People just went out, increased their animal numbers, and grazed whatever grass they could find, and whenever they wanted to do it. And it got to a point, in the beginning this was not a big issue, because there is a lot of area around. But by the time the population density was high and the animal numbers were so large, all of a sudden you had this turning point where the vegetation began to disappear. Even if you graze hard in the beginning, it doesn't mean the vegetation disappears. But if you overdo it, all of a sudden you begin to really lose it. You lose the vegetation because the goats get to the point where they pull the grass out with its roots. And in many of the project areas, the vegetation cover was down to 10%. Whereas previously this was a forest, natural grassland, in a completely intact ecosystem.
To undertake something so complex and so massive requires very careful planning. The planning team evaluated the plateau from both a macro and a micro perspective. The macro perspective was achieved by using geographical information systems to map the entire plateau and by giving each watershed a unique address. The micro perspective was acquired by participatory assessment that was then compiled into databases to learn exactly what the local people understood and what had worked in communities that had more success in protecting their environment.
And over 3 or 4 years, we designed together with the local people, it was a very active involvement, a package which you can apply in a small watershed, which on the one hand helps the farmers to improve their incomes and their lives, and on the other hand restores the ecological environment.
Gradually, principles began to emerge. In the hilly land, the experts determined that any slope over 25 degrees was unsuitable for agriculture because whatever could be produced on this land would be worth less than the ecosystem function that had been lost. This led the authorities to designate areas where farming was forbidden, where the land was allowed to return to a more natural state. Combining this principle with geographical information systems allowed for the mapping of individual fields and areas that could and should be returned to natural ecosystem function.
However, we found some places, we found some villages where certain things had been done successfully, and we looked carefully and we tried to understand what it would take to scale this up.
By analyzing the few more successful villages, the team determined that several traditional practices would have to end. New policies were formulated, banning tree cutting, planting on hillsides, and the free ranging of goats and sheep. One thing that the project learned was that you can't just work where the conditions are good, but that you must go to the worst place. In the northern part of the plateau, where rainfall is very low, shifting sands were a major problem that could overwhelm agricultural or natural lands. In these cases, dune stabilization was required to stop the desert from growing.
咱们这个过程是咱们的适合这块项目的二期过程。明年上。哎，对，明年就要开始治理。它这个植被比较差啊，你看水土流失比较严重，确实你看咱们这是沟壑纵横啊，对不对？随后呢，咱们这个按照咱们的这个规划。
Ensuring that the local people understood what was being proposed became an important early part of the project. This was not always easy.
还叫种树木，哎，果树啊。刨稻的地现在都栽有树嘛，北片都刨稻的地都现在栽有树啊。我看这些，就像我说，我在我死哎嘛。 看你们吃，哎，吃的西边份嘛。
同志们，热狗领域会战已进入3天决战的重要阶段。等会战中的干部工作要全力以赴，保证按期拿下会战工程。首要的一项是要抓工程的质量。
The leaders explained the policies, and the people discussed how this would affect them.
首先取决于我们 人口工程会战的质量，其次下来，我们就是要抓这个。可以都要达到他们项目上的标准。农民的干劲都挺卖力的。完了以后，我们准备在农田。
There were several sensitive issues, and first among them was land use rights.
And the first key policy I would talk about is the land use rights for the farmers. If the farmers build a terrace and they don't own that terrace, they will not take care of it, they will not invest in the terrace, and it will wash out the first time there is a major thunderstorm, and it's a failure. So what we have done and what we focused on together over the past 10 years is getting these policies right and implementing them on the ground, not on paper, but in the village, village by village. Every household in this project has received a long-term land use contract for every single piece that was invested in this project. Every terrace that you see, every tree planting area is contracted to a household, and they are responsible for it. That is the first part of sustainability, and it's an absolute key part.
Dividing the land affects the people's lives for years to come. It is crucial that it's done transparently. In the List Plateau, the local people themselves determined the division, and entire communities participated to ensure that the land was fairly divided. Receiving land use contracts and being paid for their labor were powerful incentives. Once it was understood that they were the direct beneficiaries of the improved land and the new sustainable agricultural methods, the people's participation became the central part of the project. Every field created was contracted to individual farming families, giving them both rights and responsibilities. By bringing effective administration to remote areas, the project helped to introduce modern management systems to communities that had relied on unsustainable traditions for generations. This addition was one more step that helped the people toward a sustainable future. One of the most common arguments against change is that poor people are so focused on survival they can't think about sustainability or environmental conservation. In order to help the local people make the transition, the List Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project hired them to implement new practices. Although historically, the people's destructive behavior had been the cause of much of the degradation, the project made their work central to restoring ecological balance. In short, the people became the solution.
Right. Oof. Powerful.
Okay. So if you're interested in that particular piece, it comes from the film Lessons of the Loose Plateau, and it's available on the academia page, and later on there'll be another slide that shows the link to the academia page. But essentially that there are a number of efforts there. One is called participatory people-centered conservation is an action that often has been focused more on he's brought that back. Oh, but yeah, there it is. At the bottom you see the academia link. That's where all my films and papers are kept. But people-centered conservation has often been focused on ecological land. And what's interesting about the List Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project was all the land had been taken by the people as economic land. They were farming right up the sides of the hills. They had cut all the trees off the tops of the mountains. And what you see in many parts of the Mediterranean, many parts of all over the world, is the same sort of thing. The landscape has been completely overtaken by economic activities. And what they showed in the List Plateau was that actually what happens is, in terms of productivity, there's a decline in productivity. So they started and they built a huge civilization out there, but at some point they started this terrible thing that leads to ecological collapse. And when they did this, their productivity disappeared. Then they actually collapsed the system, and the civilization basically ended there. So this was the place where the Han, Qin, Tang dynasties were based. But by 1,000 years ago, that was over, and the only people who lived in this area were the people who were so unfortunate that they couldn't go someplace else. So the wealthy, the powerful, they moved to Beijing. That's when Beijing became the capital. And if you look at many other places, it's very similar. So, there's a number of things. This wasn't one thing or another. It was an integrated system. So it's integrated watershed rehabilitation. It's the propagation and plant out of the keystone species. It's a massive accumulation of organic matter. And it's this differentiation between ecological and economic lands. And what happens with the differentiation is that actually you increase productivity by reducing the area in cultivation. So it's a completely counterintuitive idea. The majority of farmers, they want more land, but actually when they reduce the land, what they're getting is water, because the natural systems are infiltrating water, and they're getting a more benign climate because the temperatures are reduced and the evaporation rates are reduced. So suddenly everything changes. The other thing that I've been studying lately is cyclonic activity. These temperature differentials are enormous. I'm not sure we're going to be able to go into it all, but there's evidence of huge changes. I found in one place on one of my papers, you can see it, the Great Green Wall of China in the academia page. There's 45 degrees centigrade temperature differentials. Now that's an extreme case in the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang, but this is enormous. We need to think about what this means. In South Africa, I can find 15-20 degrees centigrade just in normal dryland systems between a place which is vegetated and a place which has been degraded. And so when we're talking about trying to hold the climate discussion to 1.5 degrees temperature changes, if we physically restore vast areas of the planet, we're going to have not only carbon sequestration, but we're going to have this physical impact on temperature differentials, and those are both surface temperatures and ambient air temperatures. So this is very complex, so those who are interested in science, there's a lot to study there, but it's clearly very important. Let's look at the next thing, and I believe I have to narrate this one. So I'm going to keep talking, and I'm going to disappear, but keep. So basically, this is a gigantic water harvesting system. But notice that they're releasing 50 to 60% of the landscape to nature. So those terraces are going to be actually less. So they're only going to be allowed to exploit those terraces. But those terraces are vastly more productive than trying to grow things on the side of the hill. And now that entire area behind there is going to be restored with trees. And also, if you use these terraces for perennial polycultures, then you get a tremendous benefit, because it's not only a physical infiltration that's happening, you're also retaining moisture, and you're sending tap roots deep into the ground, which is bringing up very deep water up to the surface. This is going to change soil moisture, and it's going to change evaporation rates, temperatures, and it's a small hydrological cycle, a microclimate that's affecting the large scale. Now, these were sort of Neolithic farmers, but then they started to move to technology. That's a quite interesting bulldozer, but it works well. And that was kind of mechanization for that. So can you keep trying to show do it exactly the same way. You show your desktop, and then you show the next video too.
Yeah. Okay. So now
this
I'm
is
gonna
Chinese nurseries, and
all right, video 5.
So one thing is that the water harvesting things, they're engineering basically, but what's really important is to have vegetative cover. So having vegetative cover, now these are the nurseries surrounding Beijing right now. And these nurseries are so capable, it's incredible. They're transplanting enormous trees. So they grow these trees. Now when they take these trees out and they transplant them into another area, they have an immediate ecosystem. And if you combine that with soil creation, it's extraordinary.
We're at the Xiaotangshan Tree Nursery in northern Beijing. And what we're seeing here is thousands and thousands of trees in 50 to 60 different varieties. They're using a technique here for transplantation that allows them to transplant trees of any age. These are trees 40 to 50 years old that were transplanted here last year. What's interesting about this technique is that you can ensure survival of the trees when you transplant them this way, and they have immediate ecological impact when you replant them.
So what's exciting about this idea is that, often we're talking about vegetative cover and polycultures and accumulation of organic matter and mulching in relationship to agriculture and productivity. Now this starts to bring us to this concept of intention. What is our intention? What are we trying to do? And so when our intention is productivity, well, that's our intention. And what's very, very interesting about this List Plateau development is their intention, they had lost the productivity. That area was basically ruined. And so what they started to do was they started to focus and change their intention. And their intention became to restore the ecological function. So it's interesting to see that when their intention was to increase the ecological function, they actually increased productivity hugely, enormously. So when their intention was to increase productivity, maybe they had some incidental or incremental increases if they used a lot of chemicals and a lot of inputs, but then they destroyed their ecological function and they had less productivity. So what's exciting about this idea is if you change the intention from productivity to function, then you get the function, but you also get increased productivity. So what does this mean? I started to consider these things not only from the physical and the scientific aspects, but from all these other sort of philosophical aspects. What's the next slide? I'm wondering what this next slide is going to be. Can you show me the next slide? Yeah. Okay. So let's look at this next one, because I started to get very philosophical about what I was seeing. And I'll try to go away after you.
All right, on video 6.
Okay. So what I realized was that we really needed to consider time, and that in geologic time, that the Earth was a molten rock, and it was surrounded by poisonous gases. And over prodigious time, first with microbial action, and then through the total colonization of the planet by biological life, the Earth was transformed into a beautiful garden. And it's a biochemical photoreactive process which takes sunlight and water and nutrients from geologic materials and transforms them into life. This is quite extraordinary. And we need to focus on this. You know, now we're talking about which is the latest iPhone or the latest device or something. These things are nothing. Our technology is nothing compared to the natural systems which created the atmosphere, the hydrological cycle, and natural climate regulation and soil fertility and biodiversity. And so as humans, as sentient beings, we need to look at this in awe and realize that our technologies, as you know, however capable they are, I mean, it's nice we're on a webinar, but you know, they're really less capable. And what I realized at some point was that human beings emerged under the canopy, and this was paradise. There was an oxygenated atmosphere, fresh water, food, and you know, everything that we need to survive. And this is paradise, and that's what our cosmologies say. And then I realized at some point, as we developed away from being prey, we became predators. And we, as predators, we probably studied other predators who use social hunting, and we became very good. We started to take out megafauna. We killed the gigantic, the mastodons. Well, this is just a cheetah nursing in the wild so that you'll like me, but you know, basically we human beings emerged in paradise, and what we see is that our cosmologies and science can be interpreted the same way. You don't have to look at evolution as something which is disagreeing with the idea that human beings emerged in paradise. We definitely emerged in paradise. Now, the interesting thing, the power of this, the idea, the understanding, this is what it's like if you take the door off a helicopter. By the way, I highly recommend it. You never need a thrill ride again if you do this. But this is in Chiapas, and you know, the power of the hydrological cycle, the enormity of the atmosphere, and the fragility of the atmosphere. When you start to realize that our impacts are really not small anymore, I think this concept of this being the Anthropocene, this is a pretty important concept, because in fact, if you look at Beijing, if you look at the big cities, if you look at the pollution, if you look at climate disruptions, if you look at biodiversity loss, if you look at hydrological dysfunction, we are, you know, human beings are acting as parasites almost on the earth. I don't think that's our role. I don't think we're supposed to do that. But I think we're exhibiting that kind of behavior. And that's a shame. We need to get off. This is Paramo in the high Andes. And they call it Paramo. The Spanish got there and they said, this is wasteland. They couldn't figure out what this was. It's a beautiful, beautiful, amazing sponge which absorbs, and its biodiversity is wonderful. So, you know, what's exciting and interesting is that this, you know, human beings emerged in paradise. But if you look at the cosmology, so let's go to the next slide. And if you look at the cosmology, it says that, you know, human beings sinned and they were, you know, expelled from the Garden of Eden. And when I consider what does that mean, it's interesting to realize that actually I think I can see original sin there, because we started, I mean, it's connected to greed and to you know, all these other things, but basically what we did was we started to degrade the biodiversity. We reduced biodiversity, which reduced biomass, which reduced the accumulation of organic matter, which altered photosynthesis, nutrient release, nutrient recycling, and infiltration and retention of rainfall. So let's go to that next one. Can you show us the next one? Yeah, and go ahead and try that, Wayne. And I like it when you do it in the same order by bringing up the
Sure.
thing,
Paradise Lost.
populating it. Yeah, there we go. So about 10 to 12,000 years ago, human beings began to do settled agriculture. And we started, and what you see, this is Neolithic agriculture. It's basically, this is going on in Ethiopia, and it's still going on in many parts of the world. But what you see here is the, plowing. I mean, this is following a Neanderthal with a sharpened stick. Basically, it's not a professor of agronomy who decided to do this. It was some Neanderthal, and it leads to total destruction because you have less biodiversity, less biomass, less accumulated organic matter, and again you have this intention. If the intention is productivity, and you just chase it, then you probably degrade the function. When your intention is function, so then you get a different result. But this result, when you follow this idea of reduction of biodiversity, reduction of biomass, and reduction of organic matter, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Amazon. So you can go into the Congo Basin or the Amazon or any place, and if you reduce biodiversity, reduce biomass, reduce accumulated organic matter, you're going to screw the hydrological system, and you're going to destroy the fertility of the soil. You're going to destroy everything, and it's going to lead to collapse. So I think that, as I went through this, I found out that as a journalist, I think you want to probably go back to your desktop, Wayne, and give us the next slide on this thing. So, yeah, I mean, really, what we're doing often, and I notice this in my, myself as I'm looking at this political situation, he who must not be named, and the political situation which is happening all over the world. We're thinking that our time is so important. It's more of this arrogance that we're important. We're not that important. We're going to die relatively soon. Thinking about Toby passing away, Bill Molenson recently. I mean, we're here for a very short time. We're just passing through. And we need to understand this. And we need to get this in perspective. And this is actually comforting. It's a little bit awesome to think about these things, but it's also very, very important that we do. You don't want to wait to the last minute to think about this. Let's go to the next slide and see where my thoughts are taking us in the. So, basically, I've been calling it the great work of our time, the idea that we can do this. And I started to come up with what's required. So about 10 years ago, 10 years into my research, I was really keen on making everybody listen to me. I think I was becoming a little bit hard to take. I know my family was saying, would you stop talking about soil and water? We don't care anymore. Leave us alone. But I wasn't willing to stop. And I found out that, if you want to do ecosystem restoration, you've got to have the understanding that it's possible to do it, because it's too big. If you don't know that it can be done, you're definitely not going to do it. You need sufficient technical and scientific understanding, or you'll mess up. I mean, you have multiple symbiotic systems. So you need to understand how each of these functions. You need an enabling policy environment, because you're really talking about something which is different. A lot of people, even in our cooperative, we have a lot of people talking about private property and public property and, you know, land trusts and all sorts of things. Well, this is these are human overlays. What I'm talking about is ecological function on the earth and a responsibility of human beings as a species, not as individuals, not as landowners, not as, you know, but as human beings, as sentient beings. Somehow we're stewards of the land, because we have sort of this frontal lobe problem and opposable thumbs, and, you know, now we're just a destructive force, but we don't have to be a destructive force. It depends on our intention. So an enabling policy environment is important, because without this, you really can't get to the scale. The scale is important. You need sufficient capital. I should say that $500 million was invested in the List Plateau over 10 years. But it's an area of 35,000 square kilometers. So imagine 35,000 square kilometers and 10 years. And you realize that per kilometer, or even per capita, the investment is tiny. You know, so compared to other types of investments, we look at, you know, these people who say, well, we're going to put up another satellite, and that's going to help us to measure something or other. We're going to have new LiDAR something. Well, that's not going to do anything for us. It's going to give us better measurement. But if we want to address climate, we're going to have to re-regulate the hydrological cycle. We're going to have to sequester carbon. We're going to have to revegetate. So gradually I started to realize we have to do this. This is the work that we have to do. And total participation is the fifth thing. So if we have these criteria, we get a good result. Let's go to the next slide. And then I think what we're going to see now, 10 years ago, I was asked by the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, and the British government to go to Africa. And so I'm going to, can you do something with the audio here or not?
Well, I'm about to play the video.
On the video. I play the video, and then can you modulate the audio on the video or not?
I'll try changing.
Don't do that first. Just start it, and then start it, and after the first bit, you can maybe moderate it. I don't. Okay, yeah. So I went to Africa to do this. I was pretty impressed by the way they looked at it. So this is in Rwanda.
Many things that I've seen in Rwanda remind me of some of the things that I've seen in China. The Chinese government was asking this generation and all the generations alive today to change the course of human history, to take the denuded landscape that they had and somehow alter this.
Okay, Raleigh, if you could lower the audio, I would appreciate it.
I'm going to present to you about a place
and I'll
called
just keep talking over this a little bit.
Plateau. It's in China.
It's not being altered.
Known as the most eroded place on Earth.
I mean, basically, the Africans took this very seriously. And I got to present at the highest levels all over the world. I mean, all over Africa, in South Africa, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. And what was interesting about this was the Rwandans, for instance, they rewrote their land use policy laws. And they wrote me a letter and said, thank you, we're rewriting our land use policy laws because we believe you. Now, that was 10 years ago. So during this period of the last 10 years, there's a lot of results in Rwanda. And they're returning their hydrological resources, which is important because they're the headwaters of the White Nile and the Congo rivers. And then they're getting back their biodiversity. They have food security at the same time that there's famine in other parts of East Africa. And they had 8.2% economic growth during this global depression, which started in 2008. So there's a lot of evidence coming out of Rwanda that, and also Ethiopia. Ethiopia shifted $380 million a year away from food aid. Food aid was the response to the famines in Ethiopia in the 1980s. Well, at the time that they were getting food aid, their population went from 25 million to 75 million, and their landscapes didn't get any better. So when I went there and showed them this, they just went, "Oh my goodness, this is what we need to do." Ethiopia is an enormous place, and what they did was they shifted the 380 million in development aid away from food assistance to sustainable land management. This is a much better idea because now they've just gone through a period of severe drought, but you don't have the type of famine that you had in the 80s because they've had a decade of restoring their hydrological cycle and their soil fertility and infiltration so they can retain moisture in the soils and in the ground rather than just have the place bake. So, you know, there's quite a lot of evidence emerging over the last few years about this. And that has taken me to ask other questions. So as a journalist, you know, if I were covering a story for CBS or something, you know, I'm looking at who, what, when, where. And, you know, so I know all of this. And then the last thing I want to know is why? Why is this happening? And what I found was, oh my goodness, you know, I understand it. It's the intentions. What are the intentions of society? So that original sin issue is not simply a question of just degrading biodiversity. It's a question of what is our intention, and when our intention is something different, when our intention is to do something for the earth, for future generations, and not simply for ourselves, we are definitely going to have a different result. And I think this is what's interesting to see, that these massive restoration projects, and the other, at the same time that these developments are going on, so I didn't know anything about permaculture, for instance, but gradually what I realized was that the principles that were emerging in permaculture were the same principles which I was seeing in large-scale ecosystem restoration. So I think there is a definite correlation between large-scale ecosystem restoration and permaculture. But I think what I've noticed is sometimes permaculture, the scale of it is a bit smaller. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, so you know, we're facing all these enormous problems, and we really want to know why. So the population, we're at 7.5 billion people. We're adding 1 billion people every 12 years. We're facing biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, corruption, economic collapse, migration, war. These are enormous issues. But they're basically all interrelated. So if we try to focus on any single one of those, we're unlikely to actually have a result. We're going to have to take them all together and realize how they're connected. And I think that ecosystem restoration is, you know, whatever future is going to happen on the Earth for human beings, whatever is the future of human civilization, you know, the Earth actually is going to be fine. It's human beings who are at risk. And so whatever the future is going to be for human beings, it's going to be better with functional ecosystems. So we need to look at these problems and realize what would happen to, let's say, population growth. A lot of people talk about population growth. What would happen to population growth if we did large-scale ecosystem restoration on a planetary scale? Well, to do large-scale ecosystem restoration on a planetary scale, you have to have tremendous amounts of vocational training. Now, what I would recommend is don't talk about this, but just put it in there and have access to contraception, women's rights, and family planning just as part of vocational training for ecosystem restoration. So you don't talk about population family planning or population at all. You just put it in there as part of the vocational training to restore ecosystems. The population growth rates will go flat. They have everywhere where there's access to contraception, women's rights, and family planning. So this is the fastest way to control population growth. Biodiversity is massively increased in the List Plateau. And, you know, some people ask about incorrect species. You know, I saw somebody who's asking about black locust and other species. What we're seeing now is that if you kind of emulate pioneer species, you have to be a little careful about invasives, definitely. But if you emulate pioneer species, a lot of pine has been planted out too, certainly around Beijing. What we're seeing now is oaks and beeches naturally reoccurring in those areas, and they need to be nurtured in order to. So what's the fastest way to reverse biodiversity loss? We need carbon sequestration to reduce climate changes. We need the microclimates to change the temperature differentials. Pollution, we don't need pollution at all. That's a question of intention. The corruption, the economic collapse, we need to realize what is true. So migration war, well, let's go to the next slide. And let me see, Raleigh, stay with me. Next slide, please. There we go. So now why? Let's go to the next slide from there. Who, what, when, where, why. So let's look at Mali. So Mali is a place where I learned something quite important. Let's look at this, and video John will talk about it.
Okay.
I'm John D. Liu. I've been traveling throughout the world to learn about how ecosystems function, seeking a path to a sustainable future. On this trip, I've begun to study and document the inner Niger Delta in Mali. Although I've been many times to the continent, this is my first visit to this part of West Africa. I'm immediately struck by the compelling beauty of the people and the extreme ecological importance of the land. traveling north from Mali's capital, Bamako, and following the Niger River, I find a complex ecological system with a very important role in regulating the Earth's hydrological cycle, weather patterns, and climate. There are patches of wetlands where rich plant diversity and bird life are evident. As we travel further north, I notice that the vegetation cover begins to thin. I'm told that much of the natural tree cover has been lost over centuries and millennia from burning wood for fuel and clearing the land for agriculture. This has caused a continuous loss of fertility and moisture and has made the simple traditional agriculture practiced here a precarious livelihood. We begin to see patches of bare, exposed earth, the result of large-scale herding of domestic animals. The government, with international development assistance, has sought to regulate the river with several dams. The reasoning behind building the dams is to control flooding, to generate electricity, and to provide irrigation to increase agricultural productivity. Below the dams are rice paddies, banana and sugarcane fields. These benefits are fairly easy to quantify, and for some seem compelling justification for building the dams. But many scientists have questioned these large engineering solutions because they massively alter the natural river system. The dams reflect the assumption that the productivity from agriculture is more valuable than the natural biological diversity or the ability to naturally regulate the complex interactions of the wetlands, the weather, and the climate. This is increasingly important because yet more dams are planned. As I begin to see the vital role that the Inner Niger Delta plays, it becomes clear that the decisions made concerning more dams will not only affect the people of the region, but the whole of North Africa and the world. For someone interested in how Earth systems function, there is much to learn in Mali. Every year, a dramatic change comes to the Inner Niger Delta. Each year, in the rainy seasons, the waters flowing from the Ghanaian highlands steadily rise to flood the lowlands below. The level typically rises as high as 6 meters over a vast area. The people who live in the delta, by long habit, know approximately what to expect. They prepare themselves and put all their belongings onto boats to seasonally migrate to higher ground. The people depend on the floods arriving as expected to bring back the waters after the dry season, to nurture the thirsty plants, to provide habitat for fish, and to provide the rhythm as well as the source of their lives. The flooded delta is a fascinating and unique ecosystem. It takes me some time to realize what huge amounts of water are present. The delta is a nesting ground for precious, rare, migratory birds. Specially adapted plants like these Borgo grasses provide habitat for the fish that traditionally provided employment for many and fed the people. These flood forests are made up of a very special subspecies of the acacia tree, Acacia kirki. These trees spend part of the year submerged and part of the year on dry land.
During the flood season, these trees drink deeply, absorbing water that remains in the local system during the drier periods. Over generations, the relentless desire to extract something that can be converted to income has vastly reduced the area covered by these trees. As these specialized habitats have been lost, the hydrological function has decreased. Many people who have never been here may perhaps be forgiven for assuming that it is inevitable for ecosystems to be depleted. But those who study this know that there is little or no biophysical reason why this ecosystem must continue to degrade. In Mali, there is even evidence of trees of gigantic size. This suggests that natural vegetation was at one time enormously larger than today. I begin to wonder, would it be possible to restore this, and what this would mean for climate control? Actively restoring vegetation here would certainly improve the lives of the people by providing them with locally and globally important work. Restoration would improve hydrological retention in a fragile part of Africa, reducing the spread of the desert, helping to control extreme weather events, and reducing human impact on the climate by naturally sequestering carbon. Mali's population of just 14 million people live in an area of 1,200,000 square kilometers. This is less than the population of Los Angeles, living in an area almost twice the size of France. From traditional reckoning, Mali is one of the poorest countries on the earth, near the bottom of many of the United Nations Human Development Indicators. The degradation and the poverty in Mali seem to be the result of a failure to value the ecosystem function. To insist that fragile but important ecological zones have no value unless they produce goods and services bought and sold by the global economy is simply wrong. Given the risks of human-induced climate change, this is an enormous mistake.
Here on the Inner Niger Delta in Mali, it's possible to see the effects of valuing productivity over function. We fail to understand that the Earth's water, its unique species of life, and its climate are regulated from places just like this. When these systems are fully functional, everybody on Earth benefits. But if we fail to value these essential functions, the local people are forced to degrade them just to survive. What's the value of the Earth's water, or biodiversity, or climate regulation? How could we consign to poverty those of us whose task it is to protect these essential functions?
There is much to learn about how the Earth's ecosystems function in the Inner Niger Delta, and we have only begun to scratch the surface. But it is clear that the hydrological, weather, and climate regulatory functions alone in the Inner Niger Delta are not only extremely valuable, but are absolutely necessary for human survival. I'm looking forward to learning more on my next visit to Mali and seeing how efforts to expand understanding and restoration of this unique and important region are progressing.
think we're way over time now.
All right, next video. Here we go.
So this is really my thinking on why.
The world is facing multiple problems. We have biodiversity loss, climate change, desertification, food insecurity, poverty, disparity, and now the threat of financial collapse. It seems like there are two conversations going on, one in the developed world, which is talking about economics and technical solutions, and another one in the developing world, which is talking about survival and sustainability. I've begun to see this differently. When it comes to survival and sustainability, there's only one story for the human species, and we're all in this together. All our problems are interrelated. Far from being mysterious, they're actually the logical outcomes of the type of economic system that we've created. And this also seems to point toward the solution. We know when we see a forest, a lake, the ocean, a natural river system, the atmosphere, that it's more valuable than computers, cars, or airplanes, which are valuable for a short time, but then become trash and pollution. Natural systems are renewable. They've evolved over billions of years, and they are infinitely valuable. Now, the global economy values production and consumption. And although few understand it, speculation. This has suggested the finite derivatives shaped from the Earth's natural systems are somehow more valuable than the infinitely renewable systems themselves. This is simply wrong. We need to admit that we made this mistake. If we were to truly value natural systems, then nature would become the basis of our money and our economy. To protect nature, then, would not be a luxury, but a necessity. This brings us much closer to the truth, because we must have water, air, and fertile soils. But we just want computers, cars, and airplanes. We can change. It will not be easy, but we can and we must do it. I think there are two possibilities. If we are thoughtful and do the right thing, then we can consciously transition to a new paradigm in which human actions and the natural environment are in harmony. The other possibility is that the current system implodes from its own corruption and mistakes, and we are forced to try to salvage whatever we can of human civilization. For the sake of the children and future generations of life, we need to consciously decide to do the right thing. When we do that, we'll understand that wealth is coming from natural ecosystem function. And this will be the basis of our money. And all human actions will go to conserving and protecting and restoring ecological function on Earth. We need to shift societal intent away from the production and consumption and waste of the economic system as we see it now, and realize that wealth is coming from natural ecosystem function. If we run out of water, if we run out of fertile soils, if we run out of air, if we alter the climate, our money is worthless. We have to understand that the true wealth on the earth is coming from natural ecological function. And if we do this, if we choose this, then our money and our economy will reflect that. And all human activity will go toward conservation and, wherever the land is degraded, restoration. Because that's the way to protect wealth, and that's the way to increase wealth.
And immediately go to the next video, if possible, please. So you need to do the same process, yeah.
The world. Once there was plenty of space, but the population is rapidly increasing, and people are consuming more and more. That has a big impact on our environment and ecosystems. A quarter of the once fertile land on Earth is now dust and sand as a result of human activity. The quality of our future depends on our ability to change these developments. The good news is it can be done with landscape restoration. That's more than just the recovery of land, because a landscape is also a community. People can revitalize an area. An economy that restores and uses the landscape with sustainable business cases. That's the goal. It all begins with inspiration, with a new future perspective for all those involved, and a common plan for restoration of the landscape. From this, jobs are created, and that leads to social bonding, and, for example, education and security. Restoration also leads to the return of natural capital, such as biodiversity, fertile land, water, and a stable climate. That attracts financial capital, first as an investment, later as a return. This is what we call the four returns: return of inspiration, return of social capital, return of natural capital, and return of financial capital. To achieve these four returns, we developed 3 landscape zones. A natural zone in which biodiversity is restored and maintained. A combined zone, which is rehabilitated with farmers working the land. And an economic zone for sustainable business activity. It takes an average of 20 years, in other words, a generation, to restore a landscape. If we start now, we will create the basis for a different world. This is what inspires us.
So the next slide, you still use the same method.
Yep.
Not real wealth. You want to go to, you're going the wrong direction with those. You want to go to the camps, camping. 12. Yeah. So, what we're working on is the creation of the Ecosystem Restoration Cooperative and Ecosystem Restoration Camps. This is different from the Commonland projects. So this is owned by a cooperative. There are now 7,300 or more people who are signed up in this cooperative. We want to build the camps ourselves. So the first thing we're going to do is build shops in order to build the cooperative. We have about 800 people who have joined this. In these shops, we're going to build the dwellings that we're going to use. We're going to experiment with different kinds, but we think teepees, yurts, and domes are pretty good. It could be Bedouin tents or safari type tents, depending on the conditions. We want them to be really comfortable with floors. They're dry, warm, and we're going to create these camps for people. Now this is slightly different because we're going to have walkways. We don't want people walking directly on the ground and causing compacted earth. We're going to put these camps in places where we're invited, and we're going to put these camps in places which are highly degraded. So the idea is to grow organic soils, to infiltrate and retain moisture using integrated watershed management techniques, and to propagate and plant out enormous amounts of keystone species, and then also to grow organic soils through composting, large-scale composting systems. But the first thing we need to do is make sure that we can learn to produce the camps and learn to camp well. So by creating the shops, we can make even tools and furniture. We'll be able to produce everything for the camps. And what we are hoping for is that, and what we're finding is that this is appealing to a large number of people who want to go and do something, to have direct action in mitigation and adaptation. we're also seeing that we're going to have to feed the people in the camp. So we're going to be doing polyculture and food forests and so on to do this. We're going to be using gray water recycling. We're going to be in some very degraded landscapes, so we're going to be very careful in order to feed the people, in order to do this. But there are two tracks to this. One is large-scale ecosystem restoration, and one is regenerative agriculture. So we're going to have a lot of people who are going to come together and collaborate to study this, and then more and more people can come and study. Probably most people will come for a few weeks or a few months, and all the conditions. You won't have to bring anything. You just will try to take care of all the basic needs, housing, and there'll be saunas and toilets and shower systems, laundry systems, industrial scale kitchens to feed everybody. And we'll use those kitchens to also do food processing and study food processing. We'll also do seed savings, so we'll be able to do quite a lot of things. This is Renee
The most
Holler.
important thing is to, as fast as possible, get vegetation to grow. And that can be, again, done in very adverse areas.
So he does even
What
mining
happens
tailing.
now, there's hardly a place in these quarries down there which has no vegetation. There's grass, there's trees, everything. Before, it was 2.5 square kilometers of desert.
So this is Chinese style tree nurseries. Again, they're doing amazing tree nurseries. These are ready for transplantation, and those are expandable. The root balls are expandable. They transmit the mycorrhiza together with the trees. The whole root ball's intact. It's pretty serious. This is an older technique. This is called fish scale terracing. It's not as effective. They have a slightly lower, they've removed the root ball, but it also works. This is in South Africa in the Learning Village. This is also connected to one of the Commonland projects, but it actually was started by students. So this is one of the things that we saw, was that students could go and start something. And it's not theoretical then. This is now very, very large. This is their nursery system, very big nursery system with keystone species. If we do this in all the camps, grow soils, propagate the keystone species, and engage large numbers of students and volunteers to plant out. So this is the plan. And these are people in Ethiopia who are leading the shift to sustainable land management. And they're very well educated, very motivated, and very capable, and it works very well. And we see that so far, in my experience, in every place around the world where we go, it's possible to do restoration. And it doesn't exactly matter, where it is. It matters that you have this. This is in Mexico, in Chiapas, and they're also planting out keystone species, very large numbers, community development. So we have about 25% of the earth that's been degraded now by human agricultural systems, and we can do much better than that. And I think that we now know from the approximately 800 people who have joined the cooperative, and we expect this to get very large, that we're going to have more and more people who are joining this. And we will be able to change those areas and start to return function. And we want to make sure that there are three organic meals per day for everybody there. We want to make sure that everybody that's in the camps is taken care of. We want to reduce the workload to maybe about 5 hours per day. So we want to do restoration, but we don't want to exhaust ourselves, and we want to have fun. We kind of want to set a standard so that these camps, once we get very good at camping, we want to use biogas and solar. We want to be off-grid, and what happens with these camps is that they can then, once we're good at it, I wouldn't say that theoretically we want to have passive solar, super insulated greenhouses, shade houses, whatever is required in the areas. Managed grazing, I noticed somebody was saying that I didn't understand about managed grazing, but what the problem really with animals is unrestricted animals. It's not. It's not. It's about consciousness, not about animals. Animals are good, but in these camps, we'd like to have multiple generations, and I think we should just go to questions now. What if you have any questions? I'd be happy to take some. Thank you for listening to me. I appreciate it. So, what are you getting questions? Or oh, Neil is here. Hello,
Yeah,
Neil.
Neil's on the line, everybody.